course, CSS Grid, which it is just simply the ultimate layout tool. Before we get into what Grid is exactly, let's go back in time a little bit to Flexbox, which we've already explored, and Flexbox amazingly was our first layout tool for CSS. Before that, we had to use floats. It was hacky. It was not fun. Hopefully you don't ever have to worry about them too much. They do definitely have their purpose, but they were annoying. And with Flexbox, it made our lives so much better. We can do some really fantastic things with it. We've seen
Right, guys. So yesterday we was doing the meme generators project, and we run into a grid, a display grid, and I was having no ideas how we do it. So yeah, we will for today we will wind down a little bit, learn the fundamentals of CSS Grid, and hopefully afterward we can like come out confident and yeah, knows everything about CSS Grid.
seen how great it is at creating layouts and, well, of course, being flexible. And that's great because when we're building responsive websites, being flexible is really, really important. But Flexbox does have its limitations. It deals with only one dimension at a time. So if we have a flex direction of row, all the flex items inside of it become columns, so we're working on the horizontal dimension. Or if we have a flex direction of column, well, we get rows, so we're working on the vertical dimension. What if we want rows and columns? Well, then we have to create extra markup because we have to create our rows, and then inside of there we have our flex items. Enter CSS Grid, which solves that problem. Grid enables us, well, as the name implies, to create a grid. That means we can work on both the vertical and horizontal axes at the same time. We can have rows and we can have columns with just one div. So we have the parent div, and that can be split up into both rows and columns. It opens up new layout possibilities that we simply didn't have before, or maybe we could do, but they were really hard to pull off. Grid really simplifies a lot. And the simplification allows us to also simplify our markup, which is great. We don't have to think about the organization of the markup as much in terms of, okay, we have, if we look back on the other thing, we had to create like a footer class because that had to be display flex to split that up into two columns. And then maybe you had other things. You had to be constantly looking at like breaking our layouts into more and more little pieces to organize those little pieces. So now we can just rely on putting the markup in the right order in a way that's logical, and then using grid to lay it out on, well, a grid. Now, while it simplifies the markup and it allows us to do some really, really nice stuff, it does come with, I put some here, it's actually a lot of added complexity. So we have all of these new properties that are coming in. There's a lot of new properties. Oh my goodness, it keeps going. It keeps going. Oh, there's more. Yeah, more. And more.
You know, grid is good. You know, like a property is good when there's like a bunch of it. There's a bunch of thing to like tweak, like tiny bits of it, so that's more allowed to be more customizable. Just like grid, I feel like yeah, most web builders at the moment are using grid to lay out, make it easier for the user, but people who code it have to know all of this, right?
There's more than just this. And the FR one there, that's not actually a property, that's a new unit that we're going to be exploring as well. So let's not jump into all of that right away, because if we go back to that, like, that would just be soul destroying trying to get into it. And it's actually one of the things that prevents people from getting into grid. They see it as too complex, whereas Flexbox, it's working for them. So why should I bother? My goal of this module of the course is to slowly introduce a lot of these. We're not going to look at every single little aspect of grid, but we're going to be looking at the ones that are the most useful for getting you building responsive websites. So we're not jumping into all of it. We're going to build a few things slowly, add on new stuff, learn new things, and then keep on building up, just like we've been doing through the other modules of this course. And let's get into it in the next lesson, where we're going to start exploring how we can actually make a grid.
Set up basic grid. Well,
all right, so how do we set up a basic grid? Well, the first step is declaring display grid on the parent of an element. this is sort of like when we do display flex, right? And when we do this, it creates a new grid formatting context. This is similar to when we use display flex, which makes a flex formatting context. And there's a lot of similarities between the two of them. The main one is that our margins no longer collapse. And with flex, the direct children will become flex items. In a display grid, the direct children will become grid items. Similar also to Flexbox, when we create a new grid container, the flex children will fall onto the grid. So if you remember Flexbox, the flex items automatically turned into columns. So when we do a display of grid, our parent becomes the grid container. It turns it into a grid right away, and the children are going to be falling onto that grid. The only real change you'll see at first, though, is that the margins are no longer collapsing. We have no dramatic making of columns like we did when we created a flex container, because now we have rows and columns, and by default, everything's just going to turn into a row. So let's go take a look. So I just have a bunch of text on my page here, nothing fancy. My CSS file has pretty much nothing going on it, and we can come in here and say, on my body, we're going to do a display of grid. When we go take a look at that, you can see my paragraphs, everything is super spaced out compared to what you might normally be seeing. Remember, I just have a bunch of paragraphs in here. Let's go turn that off and go look at it again. And you can see everything is much closer together because right now the margins are collapsing. And when I turn that off, my margins are no longer collapsing, and now we just get this double spacing effect going on. But other than that, nothing has really changed here. That's the only thing that's going on. But to properly use CSS Grid, we need to define our rows and columns, or at least one of the two of them. We never had to do this with Flexbox because Flexbox only dealt with one dimension. So it was either we're worrying about rows or columns. We switched back and forth between the two of those with our flex direction. But now with Grid, because we have both, we can explicitly create them, and then we can place the items on the grid that we've created. So we do that with grid template columns. This is a new property. And then we just define how big we want each column to be. So I could say 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 350 pixels, and that would do something like this. It would take my parent, it would divide it into a column of 200 pixels wide. This would be 200, and that last one would be 350 pixels wide. I can also add rows. So what I'm doing here is I have a row of 50 and a row of 200. If we go back to columns, you have like 1 column, 2 column, 3 column. Rows are going the other way. So we have a row here of 50 pixels because my first row is 50. And then I have a row here that is a height of 200. So anytime you're defining columns, you're defining the width of the columns. And anytime you're dealing with rows, you're always dealing with the height of each row. Let's go and give that a try, and we'll see our content sort of falling into place a little bit better. So here we're...
So row is height, and columns is width. Right, got it.
We have our display grid. I'm going to do a grid template columns, and I'll say 100 pixels, 100 pixels, 100 pixels. And if we come take a look at it now, you can see I have 3 columns of 100 pixels. It doesn't matter what my screen is because I've locked them in each with a width of 100 pixels. This text is overflowing because I made it too narrow. So let's maybe make that first one 300. I just change here to 300 and come take a look. And now I have 300, 100, 100. And you'll also notice the content just automatically placing itself on this. It's not, I didn't have to do anything. It's just automatically going. And it's automatically creating new rows of content. So you can see, we have it flowing down because it's going, my first item goes here, my second one goes here, my third one goes here. Whoop, we don't have another column because I said I only have 3 columns. So now it's falling down to there and it's flowing across. And then we have that last one all the way down here, right there. If I add another one here, let's make this one 200 pixels. Now it's automatically flowing the content across. So there, we've just added a 4th column, and you can see that it is working. So it's pretty easy to make our columns, and we can also do our rows. So grid template rows. I'm going to make the first one really big. Let's say 750 pixels, and we can make the next one, I don't know, 500 pixels. And let's go take a look. So now I'm actually scrolling down until I get to the next one. And even here, we can see we're scrolling down into this empty space because I've defined this as 500 pixels tall. So even though the content is shorter inside of that, I've pretty much placed a giant height on those columns that I'd originally created. So we're controlling both of them at the same time. We can also define our grid template columns and our grid template rows on one property. So there is a grid template shorthand. It will always start with your rows and then go into the columns. So let's say I did 100 pixels, 400 pixels.
So always row, right. Okay, let's go to Notion. That's where I take a lot of notes for my my work. I haven't taken a lot of notes lately, but yeah, CSS Grid would be worth the note taking part. React as well, but React I want to memorize it. Like you code enough for that, so that you will. It's become your natural. It become. You get used to it. Okay, so let's put it right under here and grid in CSS. Okay. So grid template is followed row
Numbers over, we'll do 250
and then slash columns, and then rows determined by height, columns determined by width, right? Okay.
250, 250. And if we go and take a look, so I have my height here. You can see the first one is very small. It's only 100 pixels, so it's pretty much the height of these. And then this second one here is really, really tall. I've also have my 3 columns that I've created. So I have 2 rows and then 3 columns here. So again, that's with the grid template shorthand, which is doing the rows first, then we do a /, and then we can do our columns after. Much easier than writing grid template rows and grid template columns when you need to be defining both of them. So having the grid is fantastic, but it's also really useful to be able to place items where we want on the grid. You might have noticed in the last one that the content places itself automatically on the grid. It just sort of flows through, as we looked at. But we can also explicitly place items where we want them to be. They don't just have to automatically flow like what was just happening. So we can tell items exactly where they want.
First of all, call it grid and row. Columns and row. Columns and row. Well, let's make this, H3. Make all of this here. Hey. Okay. It up, and then yeah. Okay, and then content placement. Okay, we do H3.
I want to live with the following properties: grid column start and grid column end. And we also have our grid row start and our grid row end. So these 4 properties are used on the flex item, not on the flex parent. So if you remember back, we had this grid right here where we set up.
All right, so let's do this. Let's change the color of this to orange, and then green, and then now we do this grid row. And then grid template columns. Shorthands. All right, change to black. That's it.
And with this grid, something that's really important is these lines that I've just highlighted. So there's the red lines, which are my column lines, and the yellow lines, which are my rows. So those are my row lines. And all of our lines actually are numbered. So from left to right, we always go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Just keeps on going as long as you've explicitly created your grid columns, which we've done here, 200, 200, 350. And always remember, if you're used to other programming languages, maybe you're used to starting at 0, and just it starts at 1. And the 1 is always this first line right here, and it's not the one here. So take that into account, because sometimes it's easy to think like, oh, 1, 2. But no, we start 1, 2, 3. And the same thing on my row, top to bottom, 1, 2, and my line 3 here. Now, why is this important? Because when we want to place items on it, we are using these align numbers to tell them where to go. So I might do something like this on one of my flex items. I might give it a background of green so we can see it, and a grid row start of 1 and a grid row end of 3. Can you think of how that might work? Like, what am I telling it when I do that? Think about it for a second. And then also my grid column start of 2 and a grid column end of 3. So if I do all that, it's going to place itself right here. So it's starting at row 1, and it's going all the way down and ending at row 3. And it also has my column start of 2, so it's starting at my column line number 2, and it's ending at column line number 3 here. Now, here we're going across 2 rows, but only in 1 column. We can pretty much go anywhere we want, though. So if I switch these numbers around a bit, I can start on my second row. So I'm only going from 2 to 3, so I'm using up 1 row, but I'm going across 3 columns because now I'm starting at line number 1. So you can play around with them. You can pretty much have something cover the entire space if you want to. The one thing you can't do is you can't like do an L, right? It has to be a square or rectangle. You cannot have an L or weirdly shaped items on your grid. It just doesn't work. So let's give it a try. I've changed the example here a little bit. So if we go and look, I just have this grid item that is sitting there. It's a little lonely, but it is sitting on a grid. It has 3 rows in it, so they're 100 pixels each, and it has 3 columns in it that are 200 pixels each. So I'm going to try first. Let's come down here and say that this has a grid column start of 1 and a grid column end of 3. And when I do that, you can see it's stretched across to reach that third line. And I can go all the way up to 4 here, and it's going to stretch the whole way across. Remember, it's 4 because we have a line before this, a line in between here. So it's line 1, line 2, line 3, and line 4 will be all the way over there. So I can also come on this and give these a grid row start of, let's start it on 2, and a grid row end of 3. If we go and take a look, you can see it's moved down because we have an empty row on top now. So this is moved down 1 row. And I could also make this a 4. And now we've doubled its height because it's crossing 2 rows of content. I think that's pretty fun. So what I
should be grid placement instead of content placement. Grid placement. So the first things is what? Define grid template row. No. And we do grid column and start grid column and determine where the content start with the grid item start and then grid items m. This is a little bit hard to understand, but I feel like this on, so columns should be this. So column like start 1 and 4 like horizontally. And then row, 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 vertically, right? Okay.
I want you to do before moving on is play around with this a little bit. Come on here and try getting it and repositioning it on this grid and seeing what you can do with it. And then once you're done with that, you can move on to the next lesson. So having the grid is fantastic, but it's also really useful to be able to place items where we want on the grid. Have you ever noticed with CSS we like our shorthands instead of having to write out these really long properties? There's a whole bunch of shorthands with grid, so let's get started in our second one. So writing grid column start and grid column end, it's long to write. A lot of the other shorthands, they're convenient, like margin. It's just nice that you can speed it up a little bit. Grid column start, grid column, like it's long. So thankfully they gave us a shorthand for these. We can do it like this: grid row, and you put the start and then /end, and then we have our grid column start /end. So this looks very similar to our grid template shorthand, where we have the rows first / and then our columns. So at least there's some consistency here in how we're doing our shorthand. So remember when we had something like this in the example, background green, we had our row start, so we're starting on line number 2, and then we're moving down to line number 3 where our row ends. And then we had our grid column start of 1, and then we stopped at our 3, so we were taking up this space. It's a lot of writing. So we can shorten it up like this. Grid row is 2/3, so we're starting at 2, and we're ending at 3. And my grid column 1 is 1/3, so we're starting at 1, and we're going over to 3. It's so much easier. And then another example, 1/2, and then 2/4, just to play around with it a little bit. So let's go give this a try. And before the end of this lesson, I'm also going to show you a cool little trick you can do with line numbers and something that's interesting with them. So I've changed the markup a bit here. I've added a second element to it. So if we go over to our CSS, you can see I've broken out the color from there, so our background, I should say. And so I have my 2 items here that we can play around with on the grid. And I'm going to go on number 2 here, and I'm going to try it out. Grid column 2/4. And that should stretch it out. And let's come on this one, and I'll do a grid row of 2/3 and a grid column of 1/4. And if we go and take a look, isn't that cool? That's fun, right? It's stretching the whole way. We're leaving a little empty spot there. Really, really cool. We're putting them exactly where we want them to be.
What if we overlap that? I want to see 1 to 3. Let's say 1 to 2, and then grid columns. 1 to 4. So push it down. Alright, now this one is going to... Oh, but I want to this one. So now this one go right under this. 2, 3. Ah. So the first one is going to be unders. Interesting.
Something. I want you to try looking at what happens if you make them overlap each other. So, what happens if they're sharing part of the grid? Maybe before you do it, think about what you think might happen, then try it out and see if you're right. So this is one of the really cool things with Grid is it's super easy to overlap content. So the first thing you might have noticed is I put 2/3 here on my grid row. So if it's starting at line number 2 and it's going down to line number 3. Now if I switch this over to a 1/3, something really interesting happens. It's going from a 1 to a 3, but it's pushed this out of the way. The reason it's done that is because I never told this grid item 2 what row to be on. So it was just hanging out wherever it was automatically finding a space available to it, and it was going there. But let's come on here and say that my grid row on this one is a 2/3. And now I have an overlapping content. Ah, so cool. So as long as you're explicitly telling them to overlap, they will. They'll try not to if you're not being specific and you're just saying flow automatically. They're going to just make room and go wherever they can fit. But as soon as you tell them to overlap, no problem. They'll overlap. And that just makes our lives a lot easier because, overlapping content was never fun to do. So this is a really cool and sort of opens up some new possibilities. Another thing that I want to look at before we finish this, just because when you're dealing with line numbers, first of all, you'll pretty much always be doing it the short way like that.
Cái này là cái tờ giấy hôm bữa thôi.
Cho lại gửi lại cho mình rồi.
Mới gửi đây hả?
Vừa xong.
Dạ.
Đây là
Gửi trên trang web hả?
không, gửi số điện thoại.
À thì chắc là cái ông kia phải.
Chìa khóa. Rồi sao? Không tìm thấy. Đã tìm thấy chưa? Có chưa? Xích xuống đây.
Mình lên đấy, mình phải lên đấy.
Tự nhiên nó lại vừa xong đấy.
Chắc là ông kia chắc sao.
Gọi từ cái số này cũng được. Thì nó biết là nó vừa gửi mình. Và mình gửi. Tin nhắn.
Không biết, đừng trả lời.
Như này chứng tỏ là nó đúng, nó ở gara nó nhắn chứ.
Thì chắc vậy, nhưng mà chưa biết mà.
Nhưng cũng hỏi tại sao là mày gửi cho tao có vấn đề gì? Hay mày tìm chìa khóa chứ như nào? Và tự nhiên lại nhắn cái đấy. Mà mày là ai?
Just try not to do the longhand. It's just really long to do, and I think this is really straightforward. So I'd always encourage you to use the shorthand when you're declaring what rows and columns you want your grid items to be on. Now, one thing you can do is with this one, where it's a 1/4, 4 is the end, right? We saw we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're taking up all the space on my columns. We're going from the start to the end of my columns. So we're taking up the full space on our grid container. Now, one thing that's interesting with line numbers is if you go from this side and go backwards, they work negatively. So here is 4. But it's also -1 and then -2 and then -3 and then -4 here. So if I switch this to -1, it's going to look exactly the same. And I'll come on to, just to show you on this one, we'll switch our columns here from a 1 to -2. So this would be -1, -2 going this way. Now, one thing that's interesting with line numbers is if you go from this side and go backwards, they work negatively. So here is 4, but it's also -1 and then -2 and then -3 and then -4 here. So if I switch this to -1, it's going to look exactly the same. And I'll come on to, just to show you on this one, we'll switch and sort of opens up some new possibilities. Another thing that I want to look at before we finish this, just because when you're dealing with line numbers, first of all, you'll pretty much always be doing it the short way like this. Try not to do the longhand. It's just really long to do, and I think this is really straightforward. So I'd always encourage you to use the shorthand when you're declaring what rows and columns you want your grid items to be on. Now, one thing you can do is with this one, where it's a 1/4, 4 is the end, right? We saw we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So we're taking up all the space on my columns. We're going from the start to the end of my columns. So we're taking up the full space on our grid container. Now, one thing that's interesting with line numbers is if you go from this side and go backwards, they work negatively. So here is 4, but it's also -1 and then -2 and then -3 and then -4 here. So if I switch this to -1, it's going to look exactly the same. And I'll come on to, just to show you on this one, we'll switch our columns here. From a 1 to -2. So this would be -1, -2 going this way. The negatives aren't used very often except for this, because this is super convenient when you want something to stretch from one side to the other, and you don't want to have to count how many columns you have. You don't want to worry about your line numbers. You just say 1, -1. You know it's going from the beginning of the first column to the end of the last column, and you have nothing really to worry about.
1 to -1. If you want to use want the item to stretch from one side to the opposite side, you can use 1/ so columns 1 over -1. Horizontally. That's why.
Maybe you do something if you have a lot of columns going on where you'll do like a 2, -2, just so you know it's pushed in on 1 on each side or something like that. So that's it for this lesson. Again, before you move on, I would really encourage you to play around with it. See, make sure you're comfortable with the shorthand compared to the longhand, and just see how you can move these items around. And once you're pretty happy and you're feeling pretty confident with it, you can move on to the next lesson.
Spanning columns.
Another way that we can place items on the grid, instead of saying the starting line and the finish line, is to also give them a span. So by default, we're always starting on the first line anyway. So if I didn't change anything on that, or if I didn't assign it, that is just going to be sitting in the first cell right there. So what I could do if I wanted this to go across 2 is we could say 1 over 3. So that would make it stretch across 3. And I did change my grid here to put a 4th column in. So it's going 3 of the 4 columns. Now what we could do instead of that is I could say how much I want it to span. So I could say span 1, it's just going to be on 1. But if I switch this over to a span 2, now it's spanning across 2 columns, and I could push that all the way up to a span 3, and now it's spanning the whole width just like that. So that's pretty cool. Now let's bring this back down to a 2, and what we can also do is tell it the start line. So I could say 2
Columns horizontally. Yep. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. 1, 2, 3, 4.
this back down to a 2, and what we can also do is tell it the start line. So I could say 2 over span 2, and now it's starting at line number 2, and then it's spanning 2 columns like that. And we can do the same thing for our rows. So if I come on this and I say grid row, start at 2 and then span, let's say 3 or something like that. So it's going to span the whole way down, and it looks like that. Or if I switch this down to a span 1, it's only going to be spanning 1. So on whether it's a grid row or a grid column, we can use the span. And if we want, depending on the circumstances, we can also just have it set as a span 1. You don't have to put the starting line. You could just have it go where it's sitting naturally.
We can span. Let's keep this this. Tips. Okay, spanning. Span. Span in grid row or grid columns. Column to determine the start. To determine how span across 2. Span 3. 5, 3, 2. Alright, so span 1 be right here. Start at 1 and then span for 2. Start at 1, span 2, 1, 1, 2, 3. So span across 2 plus 1 plus 2 is 3. It's pretty much the same as this. Three. Start at 1, span for 3, and then 4. Alright.
And add that span in there by itself. And if it's a span 1, it's not really going to do much, but we can have a span 2 or span 3 to make it span more than what it normally would. But depending on the circumstances, this is often much easier than counting your column numbers. So Grid actually has a lot of similarities to Flexbox. Before we get to those though, I just want to look at one thing that's really important, which is when we're defining our rows or sometimes our columns, we don't want to set an exact height on them because that's kind of weird, right? When we're doing our layouts, a lot of the time we want the height to just grow to match our content like we're used to. So we can do that. And well, we do that by using the auto keyword. So to take a look at an example here, I could say my grid template row is 50 pixels auto. So the first one will be 50 pixels, but then this second one here will just be auto. It's going to match whatever the height of the content is. And when it's auto, the one thing that's really important is, remember I said we can't do like L's or we can't do weird shapes. So if I had a few different flex items here that were different heights, the height of that row will be dictated by the item that has the largest height. So my orange one here is the tallest. It's going to force that row to be taller. And if we don't declare a grid template row, or if we have more rows than we've defined, they will default to auto, and that's a good thing. It's the behavior we want most of the time because it's the way we're used to working. So here, if I just declared this one here of 50, so I did like a 200, 200, and 350 for my columns, but I never declared any rows. Once items start getting placed on here, if we have 6 items, the next ones will be making their own row, and that row will be dictated by the height of the tallest one. But just like flex items, they will stretch by default. So let's go take a look at what I mean by this, or come here and look at this example. So I've added, once again, I've played around, but we're starting with the same basic structure. I've added a few things on here. And one of them I've done is I haven't declared any rows. I've set up 3 columns, and my items are automatically flowing into a second row. And just for fun, I'm going to delete this column, so we only have 2 columns. And see, they've actually come and made a third row here by themselves. And the height of these rows is being defined by the tallest item, which is all the purple ones have the same size. But this one I've created is my big, so the padding on that one is a lot bigger than the other one. So the height of that one ends up being a total, which is much bigger than my other items. So this one is growing to stretch, just like this one here. So this is really similar to Flexbox, where our items will stretch in height automatically. So just like Flexbox, we have an align items. So the thing that's interesting with align items in our Flex container is we had to do it with a Flex start or a Flex end and things like that. When we're using grid, we can just use the start or end keywords. It's not grid start or grid end, it's literally just start. So if I do align items on my grid start, we come and take a look. Well, that on this row of content where it's not grid start flex container is we had to do it with a flex start or a flex end and things like that. When we're using grid, we can just use the start or end keywords. It's not grid start or grid end, it's literally just start. So if I do align items on my grid start, we come and take a look. Well, that on this row of content where this one is shrinking to go down to its natural size. And we can, of course, use an end, and that's going to make it and push it down to the bottom. Or I can come and do a center on that, and it's going to center it in the space that it was living. And let's bring this back up to 200, just because we can also look at the baseline one as well, which actually that'll look a lot like center, but it's going to line these all up on the baseline. So align items works the same way it does in Flex. The only difference is we just use start or end instead of a flex start or a flex end. Another thing that's really interesting here, though, is we also have, along with our align items, we also have a justify items. Justify items is looking at the individual cells themselves. Because unlike Flexbox, where everything's shrinking in content to fit the size, they're stretching this way. They're stretching vertically to match the height of the row that they're inside of. And that, because this is set to auto, or because we never declared it and auto is the default, it's matching the height of my tallest one. But they're also stretching horizontally to match the width of the column that they're inside of. But maybe we don't want to do that. Maybe we don't want them to stretch like that. So that's where justify items comes in. So we can do a end, and it's going to push them all to the end of, so they're lining up at the line that's at the end. Or of course, we can do this as a start, and then they'll line up at the start. Or you guessed it, we can also do a center on that and line them up in the center. And just like Flexbox, not only can we do it on the entire grid where we're using justify items or align items, we can also do it on individual grid items as well. So I'm going to come over here and modify this a little bit. We're going to come here and do a start on this one, and we'll add an end class on this one here. We'll come back to my CSS, and I'll do a start and do an align self start. And I'm also going to do a justify self start. And we can see it is aligned self start, so it's pushed up to the top, and the justify self start is stuck it here. It's keeping its natural size instead of stretching to fit that way. Just to play with this, we could do a center on that, and then it's going to center vertically, or we could do a center on this one, and then it would center horizontally like that. And why not? I didn't call it center, I called it start, but we can center it perfectly in that space all by itself. So what I want you to try and now do is play around with the end one. So I'm going to put those back to start, go on the end one, set it up to be aligned at the end here, and then that'd be the end of this lesson. So I'm going to let you do that on your own. And
try this, and then we do align self, and right, so it's top bottom vertically, and then justified self going to be N as well, so just shift back horizontally. That's good.
of course, just do other experimentation in here, play around.
What if I don't have any padding? It literally would just, yeah. Got it. Got it.
A little bit to make sure you understand it, and then we'll move on to the next lesson. So we're going to take what we've learned about grid, and we're going to apply it to this layout to practice.
Okay.
That's a little bit of what we learned. We're not going to be starting from scratch because we've already built this, but what I've done is I've stripped out all of the references to Flex that were in our file.
Forgot what is it called? Some similarities. But wait, what we can do is here. Align and justify. We did this. Align to use align solve to item. So line would be vertically, and use just like flex, and then use justified, justify solve to align items horizontally.
And we're just going to be building it back up layout wise with grid. So if we go and take a look, this is sort of how I see the content breaking down. So we have my image here, I have my text, I have this paragraph, and then we have these two columns over here because this is broken into two. And here we have it a little bit differently. But the one thing to remember is we can't have this as two columns and this as like one big column, right? So these lines have to extend from one end to the other. So it looks something a little bit more like this. So I do find the easiest way is to visualize it like this and then just extend the lines out. So this on the small layout, we have two columns with 4 rows. And then on the large layout, we do have 3 columns and 3 rows. So let's start building it out. So the very first thing is we're going to come on our card here and we're going to do...
No, we do it ourselves. So first of all, 1 column, 2 columns, 4 row, and we do add screen size. Media, here's going to be max width 480 pixel, should be this bracket instead. Go here, copy out this, put it in here. Yup. Okay. So what is the parents element? Card footers, card content. Card content is going to have a display grid. What screen size? Maybe that's look okay. Then what is it? Grid template. Template is going to be row first, so 4 rows. FR, 1 FR, 1 FR, 1 FR. Then we do a slash, 2 columns. So 1 FR and 1 FR. Set get. Okay. Let's see the dimension.
Do a display grid on there. And we do that, not much will change. Now, before we get into it, as I said in the CSS, I've already stripped.
Oh, the cards. Oh, the cards. Should be the cards. Cards. Okay, so we have 4 columns and then two columns and 4 row. Right, row. Looks right. Or this. Maybe this. No, it's not. So you can see 4 row. 1, 2, 3, 4. Go all the way down. So let's try first image. The image would be 480. We want it to span 480 divided by 4 would be 120 pixel. 120 pixel. 120 pixel. And 120 pixel.
Out any mentions of flex except for the body one here, just to keep it right in the middle of the page. We can do that with grid too, but we'll leave it just like that for the moment. And what we'll do is I want to come here and look at how we can flatten out our markup a little bit, because before we had our card and then we had our image, because we were using that as our left column here, and then we needed all of this to be a right column to do our display flex. So we had to create a card content. Well, with grid, I don't really need that anymore, so I can get rid of it. And then in the footer, we needed 2 columns. So, well, I created a footer. Need that anymore either. So I get something that looks a little bit like this. And on a markup level, this is so much nicer, right? We have one div instead of left column here. And then we needed all of this to be a right column to do our display flex. And then...
Okay. No, I understand why this doesn't look like that. And then we need to remove this, and remove this. That is why it's not looking right. Okay. 120, 120, and 120. Each column, so we got a... Wait, this is row. Row is going to be 4 rows. Got a pictures. 2 of this.
Yes, it's a little bit more complex on the grid side, but it's not that bad. So let's go and take a look at how we can set this all up. So let's go over to my styles now. And the very first thing on our card, let's come up here and say display grid. So when I do that, let's go and explore what happened before we look at anything else. So, well, not much has happened. It looks pretty much the same. The big difference is my button is now stretching from one side to the other because it's the only thing with a background color on it. So we can see that it's stretching, but other than that, there's not really that big of a difference going on until we define our columns and rows. So we're doing the small screens first. So actually, let's come and shrink the moment. We've been looking at set values. So I'm going to change this up in a little bit, but for now, we'll stick with what we know. So we're starting with our rows. So if we come and look at our rows, well, I sort of want them all to be auto, except maybe that last one, but we saw we could use margin top to create that space there. Maybe I'll come here and we'll set an actual size, but for these other ones, I pretty much just want them to be the height of the content that's inside of them. We did use that flex basis trick though for this to define the actual height of that one. So maybe we'll use that. We'll keep that number. When we had the flex basis on there, it was 200 pixels. So 200, we'll say auto. And here we'll put 100.
So you want the image. This is row, so 200, auto.
150 pixels for that line.
Okay, so we do that. Yeah. Copy the same thing, 200 pixel, auto, and then 150 pixel. Okie dokie.
Change. Now, before we get into it, as I said, in the CSS, I've already stripped out any mentions of the actual height row. So my grid row.
Okay, so the first row should span across. So the first row is the image, called image, should span across. Grid row 1/-1 should columns. One to -1. Row start with a grid and start vertically, horizontally, columns. All right, that is how it looks. Maybe this one should be like each. So there's two columns like this and this. First row is 200 pixel. I feel like it's 100. Okay. Take off this and then auto, got image. Let's do this. Next one is a title. It's going to span across as well. Grid columns. It's already spanning across. No, it's not spanning across. So then we want it to move down here. So the row is 200 vertically. All right, 200 pixel. Okay. 15 minutes. Where's the 15 minutes? And then we do the same things. Yeah, we can do this. Copy this And then we comment the same thing with this as well. Alright. Okay, now it's spanned. I'm assuming this is 480. This is 480. 200. No, not that one. Yep. Now it's looking good. 15 minutes. I also want this to title to have like a so we got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we do grid row. So start at 2, 2, 3. Why is it overlaying? Margin top. Well, let's align all this 15 minutes. 15 minutes is would be this. And then we do dot here, align self to n. Is it really n? Nah. Maybe. Let's do it. Margin top. To m. Align self n. Let's not do flex n. And then we do a commas margin. Justified self sentence. Okay. Then what we can do is margin bottom. Two. Let's say 2m. That is good. That is good. And then we do the same things for this. Read more buttons. Want it to be oh, it's not centers. It's alright. It's alright. Maybe start. That's good. And then, yeah, it's overlapping. How can I change it so that it's not
Then yes,
overlapping?
we're going to come on our card here and
How to not let items overlapping. CSS Grid. Display grid auto 2 to 4. Okay. Grid template row. Okay. So here it should be the title. Grid template row, auto. Grid row, and then we do auto. Doesn't work. Grid row, start at 2. Right, start at 2 and end at 3. Should be this one only. Start at 2. Grid row. Start at 2 slash 3. Does it work?
We're going to do a display grid on there. So let's go and take a look at how we can set this all up. So let's go over to my styles now. Width of 100% and a height of 100%.
1 to 2. Oh, we need to state the image because it's spanning too much. Can't. Spanning too much. Image to be grid row. Grid row here to be 1/2. Right, 100%. And then width 100%. It's good. Okay. Like a margin left, like justified content centers, like a margin top, card title, and then we do grid row. Maybe I have to state the width row over here to 1/2, commas 2/3, and then the same things for card bodies. Right, 3 to 4. So margin top, justified itself, centers. Justify self, Why is it not centers? It doesn't end. And run doesn't run. What?
And what this width and the height will do is they're not matching the parent like it would normally do. So normally they'd be trying to match this card. They're instead going to be trying to match the cell that they're inside of. So that's actually fixed the problem. It's matched the title. I'm not actually going to bother with the grid rows because the grid rows are actually going to flow automatically the way we want them to, but I will do my grid column on here of 1/-1 just so it takes up all the room.
Okay. You don't need the grid row. Yeah. I think we can just do padding. Right. Padding. Last one is 150 pixel. You don't want it's like a padding here, margin here, like 1M, and margin. So 1M top, 1M left, right, no bottom, 0 and 1M. Column is span across. Sorry, you have that. But why is it not like that? Why is it not spanning across? Oh, because I have centers. Why is it like this? Let's do border 1. Let's do outline 1 pixel, solid and red. Okay. Grid row. Row from one side to the others. Grid row is not going to help.
We need the same thing on my body. Grid column 1 over -1. Now you could probably make one selector and fix all of that.
Alright, why all the text is like this? Text align, center. Oh, set the body, that's why. Title. Why is it not spanning cross? On M, and then here is, so the left is 0. There we go. Copy the same things. Alright, this one is a little bit, you don't want, this is the top, you don't want any top, right? So only left and right, so only left. This is left. Zero, 1M. Was it 2M? Is it because it's inherit from the, what is it, body? There's no margin on the body. That's kind of weird. Zero, 1M. I think it's inherit from, looks kind of the same. Let's do like an 05M and 05M here. Okay, this looks alright. Yeah, pretty much that's it.
You can see all of this is coming in. Where we have the big problem is on these, the way we want to stretch it, and already all the way to the right, because without that it will stretch the full size, but with the justify self end it's going to push it all the way over to there. And just like that, we finished our mobile layout. Now maybe I made this a little bit too tall, so we can come back up to here and say maybe this should be maybe 100 instead of 150 or something like that. But just
let's do 100. It's alright. This looks nice. It looks good.
Just like that, we've created our layout with a much simpler, flattening out the markup as much as possible. And then bottom, whoops, and this should be EM, not the letter M. And then on the sides display.
Right, then we now go to 750. There's a big screen. Big screen would be around 8. Bootstrap, big screen. Uh, 120. 1200 pixel. Alright. So let's display grid. There's 4 columns. So the first one, there's 2 row, by the way, 3 row, 1, 2, and 3, should be auto, like 150, auto, 150 pixel. Then we go to 2 columns, so it would be 2 column would be 200 pixel auto. All right. Maybe 150 pixel. What if I say auto? Auto would give you that. So let's say 150 pixel. And then auto. So the image would grid row from 1 to 2, 1, 2, -1. Right, I want the image to be all, take up all the space. Right, height 100, width 100. Then you want this to be columns from 1 to there's 3 row, 1, 2, 3, and then 3 columns. 150. This one is auto, and the last one is auto. Right. Row would be wanted to span across the row. Row would be 1 to -1. Let's delete all of this. Okay, this is what we have. Let's do the title first. Title. it would have a, this would span from here to here. So 1 img grid row 1 2 2, right? Grid columns 1 2 -1, right? A 100% run. Grid columns span like all the way horizontally. No, it should be columns. And then row. There we go. So column would span horizontally. So 1 to 2. And then title. One to 2. Just automatically do that. So we do card title, margin. Let's copy the same things here. Right. You want it to horizontally grid column 1 slash -1. Oh, it should be 2 to -1. 2 to -2. 2 till column would be 1 2. Two until 1 2 3, 2 till 4. Comments? Why there is this? Body. Grid columns 2 till 4 as well. Okay, and then also the same margin. Maybe this one should be 2. Not the top one, but the left one should be 2. Right. .75 looks good. And then we want the buttons to align self and justified self, and then we do and then we do a margin. Let's do top 0, right would be 1em, then we do a bottom 1em, then we do 0. And let's go on to the read time, I mean. This would be align self and justified self centers. And we would have a start. No, should be centers. We don't need it. We can do margin. Since this would be aligned with that, so we do the same things. And we need it to go above the bottom as well, so 1em. Right, so 1 Why is it not? So top 1, you don't need top. Margin 0. Right is 0. Top is going to be 0. And then 1em. Maybe bottom right here, so 1em. (2em). Make this smallest, 100 pixel. Yeah, that looks all right. Maybe we do 2. No, let's do 1 so that it's going to be aligned. So that's pretty much it. Okay. Wait a minute. Min width of 480. let's just do that. So, boom. Maybe you want a max width of this only. This look nice. Look nice.
Grid on there. And we do that not much. We have this, I want this gap to be here. I want a space there, just like I have my space all the way around. So I could have created another empty column in between, but in the next video, I'm going to show you another solution to that.
Grid gap.
So Grid has this really awesome property called Grid Gap. It makes creating spacing in our layouts so much easier. It's incredible how awesome this is. So we can add gaps between our rows and our columns with Grid Column Gap, as well as Grid Row Gap, or we can use the Grid Gap shorthand, as I said.
Let's go here. Grid gap. Grid gap. Grid columns gap. Pretty explainables. And then grid gap.
There's lots of shorthands when it comes to the grid properties that we have. So let's go and try it out. We're back on this. I know we said we're going to do on our layout. We're going to get back there really, really soon. But when we have the layout like this, you can see all of our items are stuck together. So what we can do is on where I've defined my grid, I can come down and I can say that my grid column gap is 2M. And it's going to give me a 2M space between my columns. And I can come on here and I can say a grid row gap of 5M. And it's going to give me a 5M space between my rows. So that's really cool, right? And as I said, we can shorten this up with just grid gap. So if I did a grid gap 1M, it's going to put 1 on my rows and my columns. Or I could do a 1M space 2M. And if I do it that way, it's going to do 1M on my rows and a 2M on my columns. Or often what I find I'm doing is I want a 0 here and only space between my columns because of how I'm doing it. Now there is one really important thing to notice is it's not putting a gap on the outside. It's only adding a gap in between my columns. So this is really, really important. And that's one of the reasons why I had to create those empty columns and empty rows at the top and bottom and the left and right of that card that we were just working on, because I can't use the gap to create the spaces like that on the outside. I can only do it to create gaps in between my rows or my columns. There's also something that's really important to know is that the grid gap property is actually being replaced by a gap property. But as of the time of this recording, it is only supported by Firefox. The cool thing with the gap is, well, it's shorter, right? Instead of grid gap, it's just gap, and you could have gap column, gap row. This gap property is also going to work in Flexbox, so it's not only going to be something that's exclusive to Grid, which is really exciting, but right now, as I said, only Firefox is supporting that, so hopefully we do get support for all of it in the future, but for now, we just have to write it with the longer grid gap instead of the short gap until the other browsers manage to catch up. It's pretty straightforward, I think, but you can play around with it a little bit here, and then in the next video, we'll fix up our card.
Right, so we do gap.
All right, so all we want to do now is add the gap to this card. Really straightforward. I'm going to let you do it and see if you can get it to look good.
5.
Cool, so I hope you did get it working. All we have to do is come where we want the gap. Now, we have to pay attention a bit to the media query because I don't want any gaps between my rows or columns. Actually, it wouldn't really hurt anything because everything is spanning, or these are so far apart, we wouldn't even really notice it anyway. But I'm only going to add it when we're at our large screen sizes. So I'm going to come inside here where I have my dot card, and we're going to say a grid gap. I'm going to use the shorthand. I want 0 on my rows, and I'm going to add 1M between my columns. So when we come and take a look, it has added that space that we wanted between them here. And if you want a bigger space, you can come and add a bigger space. There is a downside though, is it's adding that space to this side too, because we have an empty column over here. So there's different ways to get around that. One of them is you just literally include the empty one here instead of doing it as a gap. Or we could play with the size of this and actually say that we have a 0-pixel column at the side there. And then I would actually keep this over at 1em, just like that. And then we have this nice consistent spacing all the way around. It's a little bit hacky doing that with the 0-pixel column. So if you'd rather do it where you're just creating an empty grid and not bothering with the gap, I think that's fine as well. But I do want to explore how we can use it in a bit of a realistic situation. And yeah, I think that this is a nice, just basic use case for grid, just because we have the two things that are coming down here, and we can see that we could flatten up our markup a lot. Now, it is a little bit confusing at first when you're setting up all your rows and columns, especially when you can't see them. So sometimes it's really worth drawing them out or doing something where you're trying to visualize it with the lines, just so you can really keep track of what's going on. At the end of this module, I'm also going to talk about ways that you can make your life a little bit easier when it comes to dealing with grid and visualizing these lines. But for now, we're going to keep on hacking our way through this. Because we've just scratched the surface of grid, we're about to jump into some more deeper properties. But before we do that, it is actually a good time to take a break. We haven't got a lot of lessons right now. I know it's really early on. When I say a break, I mean maybe a little practice session. Make sure you're comfortable with what we've learned so far. Try and build out something else. Maybe rebuild this card completely from scratch. Go back through this, like scratch everything, or a similar layout. Just make sure you're comfortable building in columns and rows before you move on, because we're adding more stuff on top of it, and I want to make sure you're very comfortable with this. So take a little break, try building something really simple, make sure you get how you can position things on the grid and make your grid rows and grid columns. And then once you're ready for that, whether it's tomorrow or in a couple of days, come back on and we're going to keep pushing our way through the grid.
Right. So 9 till 19. We got 10 more. Yeah, let's just take a break.